imagine this conversation between me and someone out in the community. They say, "Oh, you're a pastor? That's nice." "Yes, it is," I reply. And at that moment, I never quite know where the conversation will go. Now, sometimes I'm mentioning that I'm a pastor, it leads to more conversation. And sometimes it's a conversation killer. We're done. Now, if they engage more, they might say something to me like, "Well, I've never cared much for church. I went to church when I was a kid, but then I drifted away, and I've honestly never felt the desire to go back. It's not that I'm against church. It's great that you're a pastor, but I consider myself to have faith in my own way. I don't really need it all that much." Now, you can imagine how comfortable these conversations are for me to navigate, especially when they continue with saying something like, "Well, I suppose I'm about as good as the next person. I try to live right. I support the needy. I like justice for everyone. Overall, I'm pretty happy with my life. After all, isn't that what going to church is all about?" Now, I never know what to say to something like that, but maybe I might mumble something under my breath that's a bit snarky about how, well, some people think that happiness is what it's all about. Then the other person may wrap up the conversation with saying something like this to me, like, "Well, it was nice to meet you, Mark. That's great that you're a pastor and all. I'm sure you do good for some people who really need it. And the world needs people like you who are willing to help others. It was good talking to you, and well, maybe I'll see you at church sometime." I've come to recognize that "maybe I'll come see you and worship sometime" is a way to end the conversation. And it doesn't necessarily mean I'll ever see that person in worship.
It's funny, right after we started working on this message, the South Lansing campus hosted Easter in a pub. While we were setting up the band and the band was rehearsing, I was eating my dinner and a man came in and lingered in the doorway. One of our volunteers approached him and started a conversation. So this isn't directly related to me being a pastor, but the conversation she recounted was almost exactly what Pastor Mark just described. He used to go to church, but he doesn't go much anymore. He still listens to Christian music every once in a while, and so he recognized the song that was being played. He still believes in God and everything, but he just doesn't go to church. Sometimes those kinds of interactions can bother me, especially if it seems like the person is implicitly asking me to justify or defend my own involvement in the church, my own faith, my own vocation. But usually I recognize that the person is probably trying to justify to me why they don't go to church. That person isn't necessarily trying to be malicious.
Essentially, what I hear again and again as a pastor, as I interact with people outside the church, as they reflect on the Christian faith, is this: "Thanks, but I don't need it." It's the "thanks, but no thanks" response. How do you respond when someone has that attitude toward involvement in the church, in the Christian faith?
Recently, I was invited to a dinner that was hosted with the intent of bringing diverse voices together for a unique conversation across differences. The group included all kinds of people, but I was the only pastor. There were other Christians in the room besides me. As well, there were people who might say they were spiritual but not religious, as well as people who were scientists and materialists. That is, the material world is all that there is, not that they're interested in materialism. One of these scientists really liked what I was saying in the conversation, but asked me, "Why do you need religion for any of that?" He just didn't see any need for faith or God. He was essentially saying, "Thanks, but I don't need it. My life is pretty good without faith."
And maybe you've experienced people like this. Maybe we've just described some aspect of you. This is the person who has everything, or at least they have enough that they think they don't need faith, God, or the church. These interactions are different and maybe not as weighty when you're not a pastor, but maybe you've had them with a coworker or a family member or a neighbor. The other person just doesn't see the added value of God or faith or the church. We're going to give you a moment to reflect on this idea or to imagine how you might respond if you haven't had this conversation yet with someone. Here's our next question for discussion. Have you ever interacted with a person with everything who doesn't need faith, God, or the church? How do you respond? Let's take a moment and talk about that.